The story begins with Frank Weld, who lives alone in a country house, suffering from worsening mental disorders. At night, he entertains himself by robbing his own home. One day, he tidies up the house a bit and prepares to eat, but the milk has already soured, so he heads to the couch without having breakfast. Frank is dozing off when his daughter Madison calls from a distant foreign country, but the connection breaks. Later, Frank heads into town, where the last library with real books is located. The librarian Jennifer greets him with a smile, as few people read real books anymore. She tells him that a new non-profit organization plans to convert the library to a digital format. At that moment, Frank's son Hunter calls and the elderly man leaves. On his way, he stops by a store where the clerk greets him coldly, suspecting him of petty theft. The old man leaves, ignoring her shouting. As he walks toward his house, Hunter pulls up in his car. Concerned about his father's condition, Hunter visits every 10 days, even though he lives far away. Hunter is horrified by the mess in the house and admits he would prefer to place his father in a facility where he would be well cared for, but Frank refuses to leave his home. Then, Hunter reveals a robot assistant he has bought to help his elderly father. Frank isn't happy with the gift, as he's always been against automation. However, Hunter turns on the robot and instructs it to clean the house and prepare lunch. The machine gets to work, and soon the pair are seated at the table. Frank tries to appeal to his son's emotions, saying their mother wouldn't like this innovation, but Hunter reminds him that his parents separated 30 years ago. At that moment, the robot brings out a cake it made and asks Frank to believe that it will be a good helper. Frank reluctantly agrees. The following day, the robot implemented a strict daily regimen for Frank, including healthy meals, gardening, and even shaving and walks. Frank's protests were met with the robot's threat of memory erasure and storage should he refuse compliance. This coerced Frank into obedience. A library trip followed, but Frank insisted the robot remain outside. Inside, Jennifer introduces Frank to Jake, the new library owner, and shows him the cabinet holding old books that will soon be discarded. Meanwhile, outside, a group of boys starts bothering the robot, and when Frank comes out, he suggests that the robot scare the bullies next time by saying it has a self-destruct program and starting a countdown. On their way home, Frank and his robot stop by the store where Frank steals another figurine, but the clerk catches him and demands to see his pockets. Frank manages to put the stolen item back, and the clerk lets him go. However, later, Frank is surprised to find the figurine in the robot's bag. It turns out the robot saw what happened and decided that Frank needed the item more. Frank, a two-time convict for lockpicking, educated the robot in the art, explaining his philosophy of targeting jewelry due to the insurance companies absorbing the losses. Impressed by the robot's aptitude, Frank envisioned new possibilities. The pair head to the library, where Frank shows the robot the locations of the security cameras. He then introduces the robot to Jennifer, who invites him to a party celebrating the library's conversion to digital format. When they return home, Frank tells the robot that they will commit a robbery that night. At that moment, Hunter calls, tired of Madison's constant complaints and her insistence that her brother take the robot back. But now, Frank doesn't want to give up his new partner. That night, the criminal duo head to the library and steal an antique edition of Don Quixote, but Frank doesn't notice that he's left his glasses on the table. While examining the book, Frank remembered Hunter's past request to learn thievery. Fragmented memories of his children's antics surfaced, bringing a pang of regret for his past inattentiveness. Madison's morning call revealed her surprise at Frank's acceptance of the robot. Mentioning a favor from her brother sparked her annoyance. That evening, Frank attended Jennifer's party at the repurposed library-turned-community center. Jennifer tells him about the nighttime theft and that Jake suspects the thieves are after the library's new sponsors. Their conversation is interrupted by Jake, who introduces his wife to the pair. He takes Jennifer away for a chat, leaving Frank alone. Frank starts eyeing the women's jewelry, especially the necklace worn by Jake's wife. But Jake approaches the old man, admitting he knows about Frank's criminal past and about the glasses found at the scene. Jake asks Frank not to come back again. Jennifer returns, and Frank suddenly confesses that he thinks Jake is a fraud, but she doesn't understand what he's talking about. Back at home, Frank asks the robot to turn on its visual memory, and as he examines Jake's wife's jewelry, he realizes it's extremely valuable. Later, he continues to stake out Jake's house, telling the robot more about his life. The robot continues caring for the garden and watering the ripening tomatoes. Meanwhile, Madison returns home, determined to convince her father to get rid of the machine, which she sees as ethically unacceptable. She disables the robot using a password Frank doesn't know and shows her father photos from her recent trip, unaware that it all feels burdensome to him. The next morning, Frank wakes up for the first time in a while, without his mechanical friends, and tries to turn the robot back on. But without the password, it's impossible. Madison returned with cereal, a food Frank had abandoned since the robot's healthy breakfasts began. The solitary surveillance of Jake's house no longer held any appeal. He ransacked the kitchen, desperate for food. Madison prepared lasagna, but Frank found it bland, demanding the robot's reactivation. She refuses. Later, Frank scolds his daughter for the mess in the house, saying she hasn't done what the robot easily managed. The next morning, Frank notices a striking change. Everything is sparkling clean, and his daughter is busy in the kitchen, assuring him she spent all night cleaning. But Frank catches her in a lie. She simply turned the robot back on. Frank is outraged, saying the robot isn't a servant. It can't just be turned on and off whenever someone wants. Madison reluctantly agrees and turns the robot back on. That night, Frank unveiled his robbery plan to the robot, targeting Jake's wife's jewelry, painting Jake as a freeloader. The couple's nightly parties provided the perfect opportunity. 20 meticulously planned escape routes ensured their safety, aided by Frank's knowledge of the security system's control panel. At night, the man and the robot break into Jake's house, making their way to the safe. The robot, being much stronger and faster than Frank, cracks the safe, calculating millions of possible combinations. The criminal pair pull off the heist, and although the homeowners returned earlier than expected, they manage to escape. But back home, Frank suddenly realizes that the stolen jewelry is too recognizable and it won't be easy to sell it. He decides to hide it for the time being. The next morning, the robot serves Frank and Madison cocktails when the sheriff arrives with Jake, who is convinced that his neighbor is behind the theft. The sheriff, aware of Frank's criminal past, insists on searching the house, but Madison is baffled, saying she can vouch for her father's innocence. Later, Madison bids farewell to her father, who gives her a pair of expensive earrings that he's had for a long time, advising her to sell them far from here. Madison leaves, admitting her brother was right about the robot. Spotting a surveillance van outside, Frank, recalling the sheriff's previous entry, feared his house was bugged. He raised the TV's volume, pondering hiding places for the loot. Burning his plans, he was reminded by the robot of its recordable memory, susceptible to police scrutiny. The robot requested memory erasure, a task Frank found emotionally impossible. Desperate for a solution, Frank asks the robot to call Hunter and tell him that Frank is dying. Alarmed by the message, Hunter rushes to his father's house and finds him in bed. Hunter tries to get Frank to go to the hospital, but Frank suddenly confesses that he's been a bad father and asks for his son's forgiveness. He begs Hunter to hide his briefcase without looking inside. Hunter places the briefcase in his car's trunk, but as soon as he drives away, the sheriff emerges from the van and stops him. When they open the briefcase, they find only useless porcelain figurines. The sheriff tells Hunter about the robbery next door, but the son doesn't understand why his father is being accused since he's ill. Just then, Frank casually walks out onto the porch, enraging his son, who had raced over in a panic. Jake remembers they can check the robot's memory to uncover the truth. The police surround the robot, but it suddenly announces that the self-destruct system has been activated and begins a countdown. Seeing Frank make a break for it, the police rush outside. Frank starts Hunter's car and drives away with his friend. Along the way, the robot again asks Frank to erase its memory to avoid any trouble. The pair head to the library, and as Frank talks to Jennifer about the recent events, he notices photos of his children on the wall. Then he spots a photo of himself with Jennifer and suddenly realizes that she is his wife, whom he forgot due to his illness. Frank and the robot return home, sneaking inside before the police station outside notice them. Once again, the robot asks Frank to erase its memory, saying that with a fresh start, they can plan a new heist. Hearing this argument, Frank finally agrees and shuts the robot down. Sometime later, Frank ends up in an adult daycare facility as his dementia progresses. His family visits him, and the old man is happy to feel their love and care. As they say goodbye, he slips Hunter a note hinting that the stolen jewelry is buried under the tomatoes in the garden the robot created. And that's how the movie ends. It was a really interesting story. What are your thoughts? Also, if you enjoyed the video, please subscribe. It will help me a lot.